Hi, everybody. Oh, I knew that was going to happen. I'm Mary Cork. I'm the artist development curator at A Space Arts. Today, I'm sitting at God's House Tower, our main gallery venue in Kialy Tinhngang's installation, one part of it called Fachizos, which is something we'll be talking a bit about today. Just to recap, this is A Space Arts Artist Voices program, which is really founded upon the idea of trying to unpack and demystify key topics and issues of the visual arts ecology through discussion with artists and cultural workers. A lot of what we do with this program echoes what we're doing through our exhibition program. So we try to bring in voices that respond and react to the commissions that we've got in the building. So tonight, we are really happy to welcome Kialy Tihngang, who is the artist whose work you see behind me is a 2023 Black History Month commission. Ebun Sodipo, who was our 2022 Black History Month commission, and special guest moderator, curator Hollie Douglas. So the theme of the talk tonight, the in conversation, will be storytelling and imagination as a space to form history. So what does it mean to fabulate history as opposed to finding real history? And what tensions might arise between that fabulation and the realities of the real world? So the way that this structure works, and it's worked quite well in the past, is that panelists have come up with questions for each other. And we are very, very happy to welcome audience contributions throughout. That could be either on the chat, or you can raise your hand, and Mia Delve, our curator and program manager, will be able to sort of let you, give you a kind of sign that it's okay to answer, or we'll read your questions out. And we're going to be recording this conversation. So just to let everybody know, if you don't want to be recorded, you can keep your camera off. And we've got also closed captions that should be starting. Are they on right now? They're on, yeah. We've got the closed captioning enabled. So we'll have a transcript available of the conversation as well. Right, so I am going to hand over. Firstly, we thought we would give a little bit of an overview of the two commissions that we'll really be talking about, so Ebun's and Kialy's current one. So first, I'm going to hand over to Ebun Sodipo to talk about are you doing that, Mia? Is that, oh, okay, I didn't know if that was me. Okay, to talk a bit about the commission that Ebun did last year. So I'm going to stop this right now and see if I can get to share screen. Oh. Here we go. And attempt, oh, we got somebody else in the waiting room. I'm going to press play. Right. So Ebun's commission was called For My Only Love, Yours in Body and Soul 2022. And Ebun, do you want to take it away?
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming and joining us tonight. And I'm really excited to share space with Hollie and Kialy and have a really great conversation. I'm a multidisciplinary artist and I make all kinds of work. First off, can everyone hear me okay? Okay, and I make all kinds of work. I make like sculptures, installation, performance. I write like little short stories. I make like websites, so all sorts of things. But collage is a really important part of it for me, as is thinking about Black trans women's history. And so for the commission, what I did was I went into the archives in Southampton, the Southampton archives, the library, and read like letters that residents of Southampton had written over the centuries, and kind of like took note of some events or ways of speaking and particular words and phrases and the kind of the journeys maybe that people were living, the kind of lives that they lived. And using that, I wrote 3 short letters that were exchanged between a Black trans woman who lived in Southampton at three different points in time. I think, I don't remember it right now, but I think there's the 17th century, the 18th, and then the 19th century, if I remember correctly, and they're maybe like 80 years or so, to kind of look at like one, the kind of different things that she might have had to think about, both as like a Black person, a Black woman, and a Black trans woman, and then the shifting perceptions of her neighbors about Black people and Africans in general. And so that was what I did. And to present it in the space, I went back to kind of like a staple of my practice, which is visual collage. And I went through the internet, looked for sources, did like research and into finding the kind of either places that she might have visited, the things that she might have seen, the way that Southampton was, and like every collage was like a map of Southampton at that time. And then also events that were happening in the wider world, in the British Empire, or like just I guess in the 17th century, the British Empire wasn't really any like quite small. And so yeah, different events. So you have like on screen right now is the revolution in Haiti, and that's like one of the enslaved for now freed people. And then above that is there's an image of Helen Bonham, I think is her name, Queen Victoria's granddaughter. St. Mary's, oh no, All Saints Church is there as well. And then there's like ships at the bottom to kind of thinking about the trade that Southampton was that was really big in Southampton at the time. So the collage kind of centered you and placed you in Southampton as a physical location with like historical events, while the narratives kind of took you on this journey in between, on this love story between this woman and her lover who you never hear back from and is always at sea. And yeah, I guess we can. I'm mindful at the time, so maybe we can listen to some of it as well.
Stay on that now.
For my only love. Last night, I finally made it to Ripon's gathering in Woodcote. Do you remember that black gentleman? He approached us once when we were at the market a few weeks before your departure for Jersey. He wanted us to get involved in the fight against that loathsome institution that has stolen the lives of so many of us. He invited us both to a gathering of like-minded people. Do you remember? And there truly were a great number of us there last night. More Africans than I ever would have thought resided in Southampton, but I was told later on that many had come from other places in Hampshire. We decided against it, if you remember, as his convictions seemed to stem from or were supported entirely by that other loathsome institution we are forced to partake in to become members of this community, that institution that has deadened and numbed so many of us to slavery, to the possibility of freedom, to what it means to be human. You remember me telling you that some states justify the kidnapping and inhumanity using the Bible. Admittedly, you had wanted to go, but my reticence prevented us from attending. And you know I had good reason. I have or had little intention of standing with or working with the believers of
Can everybody hear me again now? Sorry, I lose my mouse when it goes onto share screen. Thank you, Eben. That was really great. And hopefully everybody can hear that okay. So that brings us next to Kialy's Fechizos, which is on show right now at A Space at God's House Tower. And Kialy can take it away by giving us a little bit of a background description of what this work is about.
Hi everyone, and thanks for turning out, and thank you to Eben and Hollie for being here especially. So my name is Kialy. I'm a Glasgow-based multidisciplinary artist, mainly working in sculpture and textiles, video, animation, and photo montage. And I got this commission. So me and Eben were commissioned at the same time, but for consecutive years. So I've known about this commission and had this in my life for about 2 years now. and it's taken on lots of different thought forms, and the sort of narrative has changed quite a bit, but how it's solidified is it's a body of sculpture and video based on a speculation, which is that a group of African people were enslaved, and in the Middle Passage on their slave ship, they were either thrown or pushed or jumped overboard in mysterious circumstances. And at the bottom of the ocean, they encountered European maritime technology such as periscopes. And they combined that with their traditional African religious knowledge to create wearable objects which they could use to recross the Atlantic and return home safely with. And the name of the exhibition, Fetchisos, is we're still recording.
Yes, sorry, can you hear me? It's just that I had to stop sharing because I had that thing happen again where I couldn't see the thing. So keep going, Kialy, screen again, but not with the full presentation.
No problem. I will riff.
Yes. Just the images will be smaller.
So basically, the name Fetchisos is an old Portuguese word, and the Portuguese in the I think 15th or 16th century were basically the first Europeans to make contact with the African continent. And when they encountered their religious practices, which are very different from the Christianity that sort of prevailed and still does prevail in Europe, they deemed their use of objects, so masks, staffs, statues, etc., they deemed that idol worship. And they said that they engaged in this because they lacked abstract thought. And they came up with this demeaning word, fechisos, which means an object believed to have magical powers. And that idea of believing it to have magical powers was meant in a derogatory way. And for me, I wanted to look at how pre-colonial African objects and practices were viewed back then contemporarily, but also right now in terms of when they're hung in European museums, often when they're acquired in questionable circumstances. So you've got the sculptures, which are leather with a metal frame inside to keep them sort of stiff, but I wanted them to be hung in the museum space separate from the frames, which I think are on the next slide, just to sort of drill in that loss of context when pre-colonial African objects are found in these sort of sterile white cube gallery and museum spaces. And then I also made a video piece, which is called For Those in Peril on the Sea, which kind of takes the viewer through the group of enslaved people's research and development process, almost kind of their engineers creating these objects and selling them to the viewer, but also convincing themselves of the possibility that these might work. And I think there's a little clip that we can all watch.
Thank you very much, Kialy. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm going to hand over to Hollie Douglas, who is a curator who is working at Towner Gallery in Eastbourne, but in conjunction with Nineveh. So Hollie, do you want to tell us a little bit more about that? And then Hollie's going to also start in with the questions.
Hi, yeah, thanks. I just want to reiterate what everyone else said and say thank you for everyone for joining. I'm really excited. So I'm Hollie Douglas, and I am currently working on a project with Towner and Nineveh called Future Collect, which is a project that is designed to change the way that museums go around collecting by commissioning an artist of African and Asian descent to make a piece of work, which will then be acquired by a gallery, which is Towner. And this is an initiative that was started by Nineveh, and this is like the third and final year of it. So I am, I guess, familiar with the commissioning process, but really exciting. And yeah, I'm really pleased to be having this conversation because these are the kinds of things that we're thinking about. How do we have representation within the gallery space, like with artists who we're working with, and also in the artworks that we're acquiring as a public gallery. So yeah. So let's, I guess, start off the conversation. I will ask my first question, which is, I guess, addressed to both of you and both of your works, but just thinking about, I guess, history and like representation of Black bodies in history, and then, you know, extraction, as you were mentioning, Kialy, and like objects, the extraction of these objects that are now placed in museums. How does, I guess, both of your works in your commissions, like how does it attempt to kind of root itself in this historical past of like all of those objects, but also in like a more active, in an active present and future? So when you're thinking about collages, Ebun, or whether it be your sculptures, Kialy, I guess, how are you kind of using that past to reference, but also, I guess, not really promise a brighter future, but say something about the future? Don't know who wants to go first.
Well, I'm already unmuted, so I will pounce in. I think it's really interesting that you use the word active just then, because one thing that always really strikes me when I'm in a museum or gallery that has a pre-colonial African or any sort of colonized nation object is the idea that it's been stripped of its power, you know, taken out of its context completely and out of its sort of ritual, but also everyday, quite prosaic use, which would kind of activate it. But it never seems as if that power can be completely stripped from it. So it's more like these statues or masks are lying dormant and are waiting to be reactivated, whether that's through repatriation or whether that's through remaking and speculation with a sort of new story being told about them. So with Fetchisos in particular, I really wanted to give the idea, like I said, when I was talking about the hanging of the physical work, I really wanted to give the idea that they could be magically reused, but they are not understood by the curator or the archaeologist or the sort of self-appointed European custodian who's found them, and not sort of recognize that they fit together perfectly and that they are, you know, not meant to be hung and almost deadened. So yeah, I think it's not a responsibility, because I don't think Black people should ever feel that there's a, you know, that weight of redressing history like on our shoulders, but there is an excitement for me that I can use the idea that these objects aren't dead just because they've been sort of stolen and locked up, locked up on display for decades or even centuries.
Definitely. I completely agree with that. I think it's really important that they're like active and that they're given the kind of contextual meaning that they should have had in the first place, but also that these objects are like nothing without the people that they're kind of meant for or made by. But I don't know if Eben, you had anything to say on that question.
Yeah, I guess for me, when I think about history and objects and kind of like making things real or like presenting a piece of history or a narrative of history through an object, for me, the ways that I've done that, it's been kind of like I'll find like a story that I feel like needs to be told or like needs to be put in context with something. And so I guess it's really about how something is presented, what kind of story it tells, and then what kind of story it tells in the present as well. So like not only like it's telling us of this person's life or these group of people's lives, but also the reason that we're bringing this object and telling you about its uses is so that in the present like Black people can have access to this history, or we can think more deeply about like practices of homemaking, for example. I don't know, like different, like as long as the presentation of the object is always like creating a different world instead of reaffirming the kind of system of a kind of like historical system that we have at present, then I think those are like really great ways of displaying or thinking about objects in history. But for me, like when I've made the kind of last historical object that I made was partly fabulated and partly real. It was like an imagining of uh like a one-line description of an object that was found in this woman's house. But making the object, displaying the object and crafting a story around the object was really important to kind of like get people to think about a particular kind of life, about particular kind of access of freedom, of embodiment. And so like I feel like the reasons I put that object there and made that object real was to change things for the better. So I feel like the intention is really important as well. Yeah.
I think you can see that in both of the works, that there's this like active, I mean, you're active, but it's also like this proactiveness to try and get people to think about why we see objects the way we do and why we just kind of accept those kind of histories, which I think also, I know Kialy, when I asked you that question before, you were kind of speaking about I mean, not necessarily the burden, but the weight of having to redress history. And I mean, I don't know if I think your question lends itself quite nicely to that. So I don't know if you wanted to ask.
My screen is just having a little freeze. Do you mind
I can
reading
actually...
Yeah, sure. So Kialy's question is kind of thinking about the kind of responsibility that that comes with trying to redress history, and should that always be placed on people of color, and particularly when labor so often falls to already marginalized people. So do you feel that there's a responsibility as Black artists or Black women working within the field of art to kind of address those histories?
I guess I want to like quickly respond because I feel like my question is also pretty much saying the same thing. Thinking about responsibility and the kind of care that needs to be taken. And I guess like, because maybe I'll just say my question now and we can also add that into the conversation. But I was kind of thinking because I've written and I'm writing like narratives around the lives of enslaved women, particularly Black trans women, and both real and imagined. And so for me, uh there's like I always feel this kind of like fear about handling these kinds of histories, about what I'm gonna do, about where they kind of fall into. I don't want to fall into this like trap of like the pained enslaved body, like showing that kind of trauma, or presenting this like totally uncomplicated narrative of like pleasure and joy and lack of agency and pain. Like, how do you talk about these things while retaining human quality of the enslaved instead of just a literary device? And so I was like, how do you stay responsible when you're thinking about these histories and making this work? Because for me, I guess like maybe this is where I might differ from you, Kialy. Also, is it glitching? Is that me or is it?
Yeah, I think it is.
Okay, cool. It's
You
kind
still
of,
with us, Kialy? Yeah, I think she's there.
yeah. It was kind of like really sick because it also kind of went with the video. It was like very much aesthetic. It's like the work was coming into this meeting. But yeah, I guess I might differ from you, Kiana, because I do feel like um Africans are responsible and the descendants of enslaved people are responsible for the ways that we tell stories and the particular kinds of stories that we tell. For me, I feel like we're responsible because we're also creating the world in the future and we also have a stake in that. And so, especially I think as like a queer person, as a Black trans woman, when I think about history and historical accounts of Black people, Black women, in particular, there is a lot of well, there's like things that need to be answered and things that need to be expanded. And obviously there is still so much gap and there's still so much like not known and there's so much work being done to excavate and to give us a better picture of the lives of a Black woman pre like the 1850s, let's say. And so, but I'm always like, even when we're telling these stories that are necessary to tell, how are we telling them? What kind of assumptions are we making? What kind of assumptions are we making of the person who is listening? What kind of knowledges are we bringing in to tell the story and like make this narrative? So in those ways, I feel like we are responsible for how we handle and present like history. And I think also for me, when I think about history as it is right now, which is already like a series of like somewhat true, somewhat untrue facts that are backed by power, I think about like, okay, then we kind of have to remember that the version of history that is taken by most people, by a lot of people after it's like put into the world, are the versions of history that have some sort of like either social or institutional or financial backing. And so it's like we also need to be responsible that like what we're saying, if it continues to go outside of us, that the impact that it has is also like doing something for us, our descendants, and the people in the present as well. Yeah, so I hope that answers, but also maybe ask some more questions.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you wanted to respond to that, Kialy, but I just wanted to say that I agree. I think I don't necessarily feel this great sense of responsibility, but I think working in the arts, I did history of art at university, and it really frustrated me that it wasn't so much that I wasn't seeing Black history and Black art, but it was that this like other section, this other part of the story was missing and it didn't make sense. There were like lots of blank gaps, and I really wanted them to be filled in, and not because I felt that I felt like it was like a really important part of the story, and I feel like that was excluding a lot of people from accessing art and thinking that they could access that kind of world. So I think I do it. I think I did it because I wanted to see more people like me in the field, and I think that's why it's so cool to work to like get to work with artists like yourselves. But yeah, I do agree. So I don't know if you want to say anything as well.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think I was a bit flippant earlier saying that I don't think Black people should feel any responsibility to creating our own future histories and future narratives. I think what I'm sort of getting at saying is that I don't think the responsibility to go in and spot check and redress negative framings of our own histories, that feels so heavy and that feels futile because it feels sort of rooted in the white gaze and like in convincing the authors of sort of European canonical history of what is so obvious and what is so like intrinsic within ourselves. I think what Eben said really beautifully about being like the crafters of our own futures was, yeah, that really resonated with me. And I guess is what we both were kind of trying to do by crafting alternate histories in our commissions. We're sort of also crafting alternate like versions of our futures. So yeah, just to clarify that. But I also feel that we have a responsibility to treat people of the past, particularly Black people of the past, with sensitivity and with care, but also with the just the sort of realism that they would have had amazing senses of humor. And I think about, if you think about, so a European monastic manuscript with beautiful gilding and biblical verse copied out super, super carefully, and then there'll more often than not be disgusting, lewd drawing of a tree with penises growing out of it or something. There would have been people in the past, which we look at as very serious and grave, finding their own ways to carve out humor and carve out their personalities. And because so much of African history, particularly pre-colonial African history, was not written down but was orally passed down, there's maybe not such clear and obvious ways to pick out where people have put in their own stamp of humor. And I think with the sort of devastation that so many African histories contain, humor would have been one of the only ways to sort of get through it. And with my particular practice, it might be slightly dark humor, and it might be sort of laughing so that I don't cry. But I think there's definitely, I don't think that's a modern thing. And I think there's a responsibility to treat African people of the past with that wholeness.
Yeah, I just want to kind of like chime in and say like yes to this idea of like humor and like, or at least like thinking about the other dimensions of like humanness that would have existed. And I think that there is like a propensity, like a general like desire of like a lot of historians where enslaved people are like denied humanity in loads of different ways. And I think one of those ways is like I don't, again, this is like where that fear and that where that responsibility comes in, because you obviously don't want to say too much for people who haven't had a voice and who for the most part haven't been able to speak for themselves or be able to speak so openly for themselves. But I think, yeah, there is like that sense that being alive also means like being alive. And I think there's like a really rich and developing history of like the resistance of Black people, even under these great conditions of duress, is like one being funny, but also the things that people would do for love, like inside your Hartman's like book, like people who ran away, people who broke curfew for lovers and for their family and their friends. And you might have this idea that like, of course they're like so oppressed they would never like fight back, but that's kind of what human beings do all the time. And there's like a woman that I'm researching at the moment who's like enslaved but is like a completely hilarious kind of character that I'm learning about. So like I just wanted to say like yes, there is like a lot of humor in that, and I really appreciate like you bringing that to the table basically.
Yeah, and I was just about to say, that's what you did in your commission, but instead of with humor, with romance. And yeah, it just speaks so much to the wholeness of the human experience that is stripped away, and that maybe humor and romance feel like frivolous things to strip away, but they do form part of humanity. And I don't know if it's the same enslaved person you're looking at, but I remember I think she was a Canadian enslaved woman called Babette who ran away from her owners and stole money from them and used it to go to the local town and buy ribbons and bonbons and new shoes for herself. And on paper, it's kind of like, you know, why aren't you running away to somewhere, you know, with tangible freedom prospects? Like, why are you wasting your one opportunity on joy? But I can imagine when you're that oppressed and your whole life has been devoid of frivolity, that would be my first instinct. I would want a bonbon very, very much. So I feel like we need to, it is that responsibility thing. It is difficult, but I feel like we need to pepper that in at least.
But also one thing before I forget, when we think about humor in these kind of narratives and how we tell them, it's making me think about Insecure, where there's that TV show where like insane people, there's like that funny, like hilarious TV show. Like one of like how do we tell these like really difficult stories, humanizing people, but also keeping in mind that like they're living in like in quite terrible conditions. I feel like that's kind of one that is like kind of toes the line a little bit because it's so funny, but you're also kind of like should we be joking about this? But it's hilarious.
But it happens all the time. Oh, go on, Holly.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, I feel like what you're kind of like we'll get both getting at is that like these things, like when I watch Insecure, like which is for people that don't know, like a TV program, which is kind of it's like real life, like a group of young Black people in their 30s living in like LA, and the main protagonist is kind of chaotic. But I think the point is that she's like a real person, and that it's like this idea that I remember when I was speaking to you, Kialy, about your previous work, Lean Six Sigma, you were like, it's the idea that Black people can't be villains. So like, it's the idea that we can be everything and anything, not just like what was written about us in history, that I think is like really important, that we can be loved, we can want to love, we can be tender, but we can also be strong, and like all of these different things, like I feel like is kind of like why it's important to give voice to that and show that representation. But yeah. I don't know if anyone else wanted to add. No, should I move on to like another question?
Just one question.
No.
Who was the name of the woman again? The Canadian Black woman with bonbons?
It was Babette. I'll write it in the chat. But there's I'm gonna forget the scholar who is writing an entire thesis about that and about Black liberation through hair and beauty. So when I remember that, I will let you know.
But okay, so I guess moving on to, I think it might be quite nice to like ask this next question, which is kind of along the lines of what we've been discussing, but I guess I was just thinking about the collages that you're using, Ebun, and just like, I think I saw the picture of, is it the African portrait of an African man, which is like, I think quite a university well-known portrait. And just thinking about like the lack of titles of these like, well, the lack of names for these like people, not subjects, but like these people that were sitters, and like the fact that they're all just called like African man, African women, whatever. And just thinking about why it's really important to like, I guess, create these narratives. And even though they're like fabulated or imagined, like, why is it so important to like almost like give them a narrative or give them a voice, and kind of counter that idea of like being passive, just like being there to just like sitting and like being observed? Like, why is that important? You're on mute.
Sorry, thank you. I think like we've been saying, there's a propensity for like white forms of knowledge of history making to kind of cast Black people as in some way like less than human, not quite human, and whether that's the denial of personhood, a denial of complexity, or denial of like kinship or whatever. There's always like a kind of way that Black humanity is like undermined, and I think that's kind of one of the ways. I mean, like, I think also the anonymity of these figures kind of speaks a particular time where the cities were actually not, obviously not people with great power, not people that needed to be remembered. And so that kind of tells another story also about power in general, and about how we tell history, who's the heroes of history as well. And so like part of making a narrative around these figures is to kind of, I don't like, fulfill a curiosity, but also to show other people like what life was actually like, and to remember that like people are human beings. There's I think also there's Lore, the woman in like that painting of, I always call her Olympia's maid, but I forgot what the painting is called. It's like
Is
painting
it the Manet painting? I don't know.
yeah, the Manet
Yeah,
painting.
yeah,
Laura
yeah.
is like this woman, and she's building like another painter's work as well. But like you don't know anything about her until like until like a decade or two ago, when people went to research and do the work of like recovering who she was, because clearly these figures were like props, objects, kind of. They're not supposed to give you an insight into what it means to be human at that time. Instead, they are the props for other human beings at that time, and not just like as enslaved people, but just as like, even if they were free, thinking about this image that I've used in other work before, portrait of Madeline, which was used to be called the portrait of a Negro woman. And thinking about the way that her body was literally used as like a prop to talk about enslavement and freedom in France, and like and womanhood in France by white women. So there's like, I think there's that ongoing history, and that ongoing kind of, like I said, dehumanization of Black people. But I think, yeah, I think it's important for us as Black people, looking back in time, living in a world where it's supposed to be possible to look back in time, right? We're supposed to be able to kind of place ourselves in the past as human beings. That's kind of what makes like a modern human being, having this access to history, having this access to like to be able to like reflect yourself back in the past. And I think for a lot of us that isn't possible, or very hard, or just like, if you try to imagine yourself, the only place that you have to go in history as you know it is like enslavement. And not many people want to do that. So this gives us like different kinds of possibilities. Imagine these stories, imagine what kind of lives these people would have had, and also the kind of context under which they came to be painted as well. Because sometimes you might think like, oh, that's really like a beautiful image that tells a really good story, but actually it's telling like a completely horrific like other story as well. So yeah, I hope that kind of, yeah, answer the question in some way.
No, definitely. And I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Kialy. I know you're working slightly in a different medium, but I guess still like the application can be still the same. Like, how do you feel that, I guess it's important to like giving, yeah, how do you feel like that it might be important to your practice as well?
Yeah, I think, Evan, when you just said the ability to reflect yourself back into the past is such a sort of interesting and mind-blowing phrase, but I guess what I've been trying to do, reflect myself back into the past, and yeah, sort of reckon with what sort of stares back. But yeah, I mean, it's a completely different medium, but I'm also really interested in portraiture, which does feature Black people in Europe, particularly in the sort of 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, and the sort of collaging of a Black page boy or servant with like pearls and other sort of treasures from the colony. It sort of objectification by adornment. Yeah, it's so interesting to pick up on that, and then also the literal placement, like often at the side or the corner or the bottom of the canvas. And I think so Claudette Wilson is like did like a drawing series about that. Slightly, yeah, off topic completely. But yeah, I think when you were talking about collaging, that I think one of my questions for you, Eben, was talking about like collaging time, and I can ask that now if that's okay, Holly.
Yeah, go for it, please.
So yeah, so Eben, in your God's House Tower commission, but also in other exhibitions I've seen of yours, I'm the one at VO Curations, that was so beautiful. There's a deliberate mixing of imagery from conflicting and contrasting time periods, and that to me is like your version of time travel, or experiencing many time periods at once. And I think that's really interesting in this time and day, considering that we're obviously like moving forward in the passage of time, but we also seem to be regressing socially in so many different ways, and regressing in terms of peace. So I wonder, like, how do you think about time or time periods or time travel as a tool for fabulation?
So I guess for me, in this particular work with like the time travel aspect, it's kind of like these, in one sense, like images and sights and different kinds of senses can really transport you through time. And so for me, it's kind of like that's the work that this is doing. But also I feel like as Black people, and I guess like this is like a big point about marginalization, but something I guess specific to Black people living in the West is the sense of like, and living in an unending time while also living apparently in the modern world, whereas like when you can kind of see the same things happening as they did like in 1955, like that Times cover, that was really like, this is what was happening back then, but also just the ongoingness of enslavement in the Americas, as Saidiya Hartman would say, the ongoingness of colonization and just like slight transformations. The kind of place that Black people have in European imagination still is the same kind of thing. The response of like, let's say, Southern Europe to Black people coming over is still kind of the same thing. So there's a deep sense that I think for Black people and a lot of different other marginalized people, that you're still in the same place, just it looks slightly different, and maybe you've kind of forward, but you're still in the same place. So there's like a weird folding of time that happens, and so that kind of I like to explore that in the work through like mixing up the times, through like creating a continuation, yes, making something like continuous. So it's like maybe that's not the word for it, but like coterminous or whatever. So it's like we're still living the same time. There's no really, the reasons that we can distinguish this period from this other period is like when we think about it from the perspective of Black people, how do we like periodicize? How do we think of like the passage of time? How do we think of like something as over or ongoing? So I guess that for me is like when I'm thinking of that time travel, we do that all the time as Black people, not a lot. And so I feel like it becomes quite intuitive. So it becomes like a part of the way that I tell a story about like what is normal and what is not, about what we go through, about how we experience the world, as well. But I guess I also wanted to kind of follow on from the last question in terms of like collage and in subject and things like that, and think about it in my practice as well as like these people that don't speak for themselves. And so like for me, my practice, because I do use collage, and when I think about these silent voices, I'm thinking about like who's speaking for them, and like what is my role in like in their voice production, I guess. How are they speaking through me? Are they speaking through me? Should they be speaking through me? And a lot of the time is someone who has had as coming from a group of people who has had very little effect, apparently, on what history is and how history will run, it's also my way, taking charge and making these collages and making these videos is also my way of like unsilencing myself while also silencing other people. So like there is still that element of silence, and like my work isn't like totally everyone's speaking, everyone can have a point of view or like a thing. I'm like, other people will say, tell your story, but in this moment, this is the story that I want to tell, and perhaps for right now, you can you can keep it. So I feel like that happens in my collages as well sometimes. Um, yeah, and yeah, so I guess yeah, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that made so much sense. And as you've just explained it, it's so visual in that, you know, perhaps a Eurocentric telling of history is the first image on a collage, but you're sticking yourself down, and it's not completely covering that telling, but it's putting yourself in the position of power, and you're at the forefront of the image. And it also creates a kind of endlessness in your work where you can continue to layer more and more images and perspectives on top of that as you see fit, but you're in control.
Yeah, I guess also I want to ask a question about your work in the video that you made, and like there was something that you said like this was like the enslaved people like prototyping these kind of things, and then there's all these actions being performed in like this world that exists under the water. And I guess it's like you are, and then you also said like I'm asking this question and then kind of seeing what comes back. But I'm also like how there is something there about like the creation, the use of all these European material to create like a way out and a way into the future. And I guess I want you to speak more about that. I listened to like the conversation that we had with Mia, and I'm thinking about like the master's tools and like you said, and I want to give you like space to like talk more about that in particular, but also as like people living now having access to particular tools and ways of accessing history, and then we're telling the story of history, and like do we see like what are the ways in which you've like actively pushed away from European ways of telling history, perhaps? And maybe that's in like the fabulation, the speculative quality of your narrative in terms of there's like this magic to them. But I guess like, yeah, I want you to talk more about this
Yep.
magic, and also this the fact that the people are making the future out of cobbling it together, really, out of what they have to hand.
Yeah, I think just to share what Evan's referring to, so when I was thinking about this speculation in Fetusos, where the enslaved people are at the bottom of the ocean, magically alive but stuck, and they encounter this abandoned European maritime technology, and they magically fuse that with their own African Fetusos to create these vessels to return home in. And to me, as I was sort of thinking through the concepts, I was thinking, does it feel right that the successful method that they find to return home in involves this European maritime technology, which so far is what has gotten them into enslavement and subjugation? And you know, I've looked into a lot of European colonial nautical advances, like the invention of tools like astrolabes, and even the sort of more sophisticated plotting of maps and globes in order to find and plot and plan more successful colonization. So it felt slightly strange to me that they would encounter these European tools and use those. So in my head, the tools were met with a distrust and a sense of a last resort. And the Audre Lorde title, The Master's Tools, will never dismantle the master's house. I felt like they would have that in mind, and they would be sort of begrudgingly cobbling the fetchisos together, trying to sort of stamp that down. And the way that the sculptures are hung in the gallery, to me, suggests that these are failed prototypes, and the fact that they've been found and hung in a gallery suggests that they've been dredged and shipwrecked. And there's an idea of hope for me in the idea that there were successful versions of these that will never be found by us here in Britain because they were used to successfully return home. And in the video, the sort of clip that you saw was imbued with that careful optimism, that sort of begrudging optimism of this is our only resort. And so I sort of used a lot of the visual language of advertisements and, you know, put a sort of sparkling filters and placed the sculptures, placed them, recorded them being worn, and then placed that in an underwater context, which felt like stock footage and felt like when you see a really too good to be true infomercial for a miracle product that's going to save your life. And then you buy it and you realize it's terribly made and you've been lied to. But for a minute, between the buying and between the receiving, there is that sense of hope and optimism. So that's what I kind of wanted to get across. And it's interesting to think about, or to be asked about, specifically looking to European tools, because when you were speaking earlier about time travel and about Black people inadvertently going through that every day, it made me think about having African parents and having a culturally stricter household, which felt more set in the past, but then leaving and going to school in the UK and feeling like I'm in a separate, maybe parallel, but different time zone. And then that made me think of the sort of colonial schooling being transported abroad. Because when I lived in the Ivory Coast for about 2 years of my childhood, and I remember in my school I did home economics, which to anyone of my age that I speak about now, it feels like a relic from the past. And it was separated by gender, and it was me and the other girls learning how to sew buttons, whilst the boys got to, I don't know, I have no idea what they did. And so it felt like that time travel, the stuckness in the past is sort of also set by a colonial force. So it to me just speaks to the like constructible nature of time. Like you can keep things in the past culturally and societally if you choose to. And so if that's been done to us, then it can be, we can sort of regain that power and do it to ourselves, which is quite exciting. And what I kind of do with a lot of sort of Y2K and internet culture aesthetics, I can sort of place myself anywhere, and that can be in the past, but it's my choice.
I like that you can place yourself anywhere. But yeah, I grew up in Nigeria, and so I feel like I also have experience of like not just the strict family, but also the kind of sense of time. I feel like there's colonial time, post-colonial time, and then like I don't know, metropole time. And like what Ruth Wilson Gilmore kind of says this thing about like inequality and power. I know I'll be butchering it. I paraphrasing heavily here, but it was like in the metropole, or like in the West and these quote unquote developed countries, time is smaller and faster. Things like move at a bigger pace. You can get to somewhere really easily, really quickly. But in like the global South, time is bigger, time moves slower, time, it takes time for time to do time, because there's like less there's less infrastructure, loads of different reasons as to why like doing something might take a far longer time than doing something else. Speaking to someone on the phone, just up the phone, you need to do this, you need to like make sure that your bills and blah blah. And so I think there's like that also. It just really reminded me as you were speaking of like there's a reason why we have like a, maybe not time inequality, but like a difference in the perception of time, that we can think about it through like inequality and in colonial histories and all of these things. But yeah, no, thank you. I also like begrudging optimism as well, because I think that is kind of like the way that we have to deal with a lot of things as well. I'm thinking about, this is off topic, but think about like solidarity and resistance and how build solidarity, and it's kind of like this begrudging optimism that like I can work with this person even though we don't share the same ideas, because we're building a world together and we're doing this thing together. So I feel like it's a really, really useful term, begrudging optimism, in loads of different ways.
I was just going to add as well, I'm really interested at the moment in this idea of dreaming and imagination as resistance and freedom, because I think that we don't often get to dream and imagine things as like from a creative point, but also just in terms of like freedom, like not dreaming of freedom, but I think to be free is like my favorite quote is, I think I read by Steve McQueen the other day, and he says like, I dream that every day I wake up and I see beauty, like that, like beauty is repetition. And like it's such a beautiful quote, but it's just like it kind of talks about the need that we have to dream, and not dream outside of like the reality of like what's happening, but just, I guess, begrudging optimism or like some kind of form of hope, I think, for the future. And yeah, I don't know, I just wanted to like add that. I feel like what you were saying, Ebun, made me think about that.
I think that kind of, I was like typing as you were speaking because I didn't want to forget, but like the idea of dreaming and fabulation, and it makes me think about like one of the things that I was gonna ask was like, what is like at stake? Like, why is it important? Like, why, especially when we think about like imagination versus fact, truth versus something that is untrue, and whether or not, no matter how like severely untrue something is, what's the use? Like, what is at stake at using the power of imagination is like marginalized people. And I think we've obviously spoken about it so many times, so much here already, but I think it's also like it allows us to like pinpoint the things that are wrong and where we can like make changes and where we need to make changes in our lives. So we like imagine, like I love that quote that you just gave, like I want to wake up and see beauty every day. And it's like, okay, well, how do I make that happen? How do I do that? Like, how do I get there? And you have to like answer and follow your imagination and like answer it in some way. But yeah, I guess I didn't like write it down or ask it properly, because it's like, how do you ask that? Like, what is at stake at imagination versus like reality? But I guess if like you guys have responses to that, I would love to also hear.
I don't know if Hollie, you wanted to respond.
Yeah, sure. I think it's a really contentious question to ask right now, because I feel I'm especially so surrounded by a billion different versions of the truth looking online with the Palestine conflict. And it feels like some people find it really comforting to cling on to their truth, and it speaks to the power of just believing something that can be true enough for you. Like I think the writing of history is not objective, truth is not objective, and so it's really difficult to even think about what the difference is between reality and imagination, because when we look at Western canonical history, it is as it would be if there was more of a preserved written history in African cultures, or if they were kept, because we have no idea what has been destroyed. So might be rambling a bit and going off topic from the question, but I feel as artists, and not as historians, with the same, or journalists with the same motivation to discover facts and report them as is. I think there's a level of intuition that we can use with like a scrap of fact. Because I feel when I was researching how the Portuguese initially created their first colonies within Africa, I was looking at English translations of Latin translations of Portuguese texts that were deeply racist and deeply rooted in stereotype. So I'm looking at a translation of bias, of ignorance, of so many different stretches and mutators of truth, that I just feel like I can't put much stock in any history, and I feel that gives me license to like bend it to my will and bend it to my audience, which I'm aiming for that to be other Black people, and to bring them joy and validation and sort of alternatives, which is again a contentious word in an alternative facts post-truth society, post-truth landscape. But I feel like that's where we are, and I feel like that's what we can do, and it's certainly what I'm doing unabashedly.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. As I mean, I've spoken to you, I think, Kialy, about this before, but I think I was reading a book, and I think it was David Olusoga's book on being Black and British, and it was talking about when these people were like going on boats to the continent and discovering African people, and the way that they were describing them was like barbaric and savage. And then it got to the point where people didn't even have to go. They were already just writing about us as though we were that, because the story had already been written. So I think, and we're kind of, I don't want to like go too much off topic, but we're kind of seeing that today. Like we're seeing that now at present, that history has already kind of been written. It's by someone else, like a more dominant colonial power is already writing history. So I think it's really important to like allow ourselves to imagine a future in which, that doesn't happen, or hope for it, at least, I think, through, whether it be artwork, or writing or music. And I think as well, I just wanted to, I'm not sure what time questions are at, but I just wanted to also ask.
I was just going to say, Hollie, like go, I think finish up with your
I just
a couple of questions. So
cool. I was just going to ask, we've spoken a lot about like our responsibility and the onus on us, but I think actually, because this is a commission, it'd be nice to talk about why you think it's really important for art institutions and organizations to also be backing these histories, and not just putting money and acquiring pieces of work like the ones that we're talking about in your collages even, but like to support artists that are actually imagining new histories. So I think that might be a nice way to end, if you want to answer that.
I guess I can go. I guess for me, I feel like it's like I've been very lucky in the last few years to be able to like live as an artist, and to make work as an artist, and to be able to really dedicate time to like learning the craft of being an artist, learning, like doing the research, speaking to loads of people, and like building like ideas and narratives that I want to explore, that I want to like deepen, to be able to like find like historical figures. I feel like that's all because I've like had the opportunity as an artist to do that. And so I'm like, please give more of us like the opportunity to do that, because that's really what it is. But I feel like what is at stake is like, I always say that I make work for Black trans people of the future, because I always kind of imagined how much of a mess I was when I was younger. And I don't really want that for other people. And I feel like part of that is being able to locate yourself as a real human being that is worthy of existence. And I feel like that is like having historical presence. Like historical presence does add a weight to your own like presence. And so this work that we're doing, that hopefully the institutions support, is like maybe not life-changing, but definitely is going to change something in the future for how people like speak about each other, for how people imagine each other. And I feel like a lot of the work that has helped me become the person that I am. And I feel like also for people in institutions, the work that has helped them become the person that they are is this kind of work that imagines the world differently, that imagines the past, and also tells us like, hey, we can build a different future, and maybe let's figure out to get there. Like all of us are kind of beneficiaries of these, of like the imaginations of our elders and ancestors. And so I'm like, do this for yourself and do this for like people who are coming after. It's very necessary. Yeah, I think we should just really destabilize what the vision of the world is. And like another thing that is really important for people to remember is that like, although like we can talk about like Black people in history, in Africa in history, when we really think about how often we think about a global history, Africa's not really present there. It's like almost non-existent, and that in itself is another like way of dehumanizing people. So like these things are to remedy that, right? They're supposed to resist that account of the world and the globe. They're supposed to also change how we tell stories, how we remember stories. What do we like, what are we supposed to do with the reliance on written and textual history, when as you said before, like there's a lot of like, there's a rich oral history on the continent. How do we go back to that if we need to? Like, how do we deepen that and make it something suitable for the present without having to give in to like a European logic of text over word, right? Of evidence over feeling, let's say, of that kind of binary, that kind of dichotomy that I feel like is one of the really core things of European cosmology. Like, how do we do all that? But yeah, that's my response.
Yeah, I think I'm really amazed that you can sort of confidently say past you was a mess and current you isn't, because I can't relate. But I agree in that that remedial property of commissioning projects such as these and artists such as us is really evident, is really strong, is really necessary and needed. And then there's also the sort of me putting myself on the other side's shoes of having so many stakeholders to appease. I think that's not something that, you know, thankfully really affected me with this commission, but even remembering being asked, could you make it more Southampton? And I remember trying to sort of bend the ideas to see if they could be more localized. And in the end, as you've seen from the pictures and the clips, I went for something that is not localized to Southampton. It is kind of generalized to the history of enslavement and of the Middle Passage, and an untold, newly imagined history of under that sea. So I think it's really important for these commissions to be made and then sort of let loose and like let artists and Black artists run free and not be in a position of appeasement, because that would just be sort of upholding the same structures that we're trying to talk about and disseminate in our work. So it's kind of a difficult one, because, you know, just speaking for myself, I've had a really good experience here, and if I was on a Zoom with maybe other arts organizations, I'd have different things to ask. But yeah, I think bigger, it's institutions with the money and the backing to make change aren't making the changes, so it's really them that we should be targeting.
Right, on that note, shall we open it up to some questions? We've got a couple in the feed. I don't know, they were asked in a particular order, but something makes me feel that we should ask the second one that came in first, because I think it unpacks a little bit of the terminology that's being used, or maybe ask you to respond to that, and then we can go to the one that came in first as the second question. So could you speak a bit more about the term fabulation? This is not a term I've heard before. I understand it as a way of creating a possible history that fills a vacuum. Is that right? You're on me, yeah.
Yeah, I thought I could find a definition of it, but no, I can. But yeah, that's pretty correct. So I guess a fabulation is like an imagined narrative, something that you've made up, and it's being very real and obvious about the made up fact of it, while also it can be like based on real history, I guess, in this context. But the fabulation, I guess, is like a particular, yeah, it's a particular way of like storytelling and writing a narrative. And I think the way that I've come across it, besides like in general parlance, is through the work of Saidiya Hartman and the idea of critical fabulation, which is kind of a really careful telling of like a fictionalized narrative of the interior lives of someone. They're paying really close attention and taking a great deal of care in how you tell the story of like a real person, a historical figure, particularly Black women. And critical fabulation is it is to fill the gap, but it is to like also restore a form of knowledge, I guess, in kind of my idea. But yeah, for me, critical fabulation is a really close, really rigorous kind of research-led process that then leads you into imagining in as close to reality, I guess, as something that might have happened, that probably did happen, as opposed to just something that maybe could have happened or something that would never have happened. You're like something that might have happened is the part of like critical fabulation for me. But I might be wrong in my definition, so anyone feel free to correct me on that.
I was just going to jump off of what Ebun said, but yeah, also that use of like archival materials as like the source of history, that the narrative is a bit more, I guess, not creative, but is kind of a bit more imagined. And I know you're talking about Lydia Hartman, so I just wanted to say, if anyone hasn't read her book, it's really good. It's called Wayward Lives of Beautiful.
Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments.
Yeah,
Sorry,
that's really an
froze
example
there.
of that.
I'll put it in the chat as well so people can see.
Yeah, I was going to say that fabulation is actually a term that Ebun, you like brought to my attention, and so just from looking it up, because when I speak about my work, I speak a lot about speculation and fiction, and what it seemed differentiated fabulation is that commitment to like standing in the artifice of it, like a sort of like centering of that this is something imagined, almost like an exposed seam in a piece of clothing. And I guess that speaks to what I was talking about earlier in terms of I see no problem in using a scrap of historical truth in quotes and then extrapolating on top of that in a very absurd and very discernibly constructed way. That was how I sort of interpreted it.
Great, thank you. We have another question as well, which is sort of a bit more about, I guess, the truth, I guess, like actual objects and sort of concrete things that aren't sort of invented. But it was one of the first questions to come in. How do you feel about pre-colonial African objects in private collections as opposed to white cube spaces in museums? Go for it.
Stop it. Stop it. Don't do it. I guess it also depends on what, like, I mean, it's really difficult to describe like the purpose of these objects, but like a lot of them, like almost all, if not actually all of them, were like stolen. So like maybe like, and also like there's this idea of like property, that this kind of reaffirms on the question, but the idea that like, oh, this is mine and I deserve to have it, and I paid for it, I did this, so I deserve to have it. I think there's an idea of like private property that maybe we should like question a little bit as to whether or not you deserve to own something like this. And also like these objects are probably made for communal use as opposed to like private use. So you've like taking them, I don't like, for me, if it's a private collection, I see that as like in a way worse than the museum, because this is like, obviously I don't know people who have these objects, and I think it's like also, and when I'm imagining private objects and pre-colonial African objects, I'm imagining things that were stolen, things that should be repatriated, taken back. Histories that should have been given back, because your possession of them is kind of telling me that you're fine with them being stolen and that you're fine with the particular histories that this objects come with. But then I also think about Black African people and the way that we use these objects in our houses. And perhaps they're not actual pre-colonial objects, perhaps they're fabrications of them. But in the case that they are, I'm also kind of like, I guess I would also say the same, like, think about the context this object came from, the kind of history it has, and whether or not you deserve to feel something with this object or whether or not it should be given away. I think we have to kind of like make sacrifices, though I don't know how much of a sacrifice it is to give up this object, but to make sacrifices to like remedy the world and also to build the future that we want. And we have to like act now to like change the future. So I guess that's my response. It's like, don't do it. If I see that you have one, I would just, my estimation of you plunges, but I'm just one person, so maybe it doesn't matter.
Make that too. Yeah, I think it is completely on the same level as institutional acquisition, if not worse, in that sense that Eben touched on, in that it doesn't even have the distance that institutions like to give themselves. You know, oh, they're just in our collection. If you are a private owner, the onus is on you. And I feel, I guess what the question asker is alluding to is a sort of non-African person or collector owning these pre-colonial. Is that someone waving? Okay. Sorry, my screen's really bad. Do you want to respond?
That question came from Dave, who was saying.
Oh right, okay. Yeah, so presumably you're alluding to these pre-colonial African objects not being in the hands of, you know, descendants or countrymen, and it really does feel like if you're that interested in these histories and these objects and these artifacts, then you should really want them to be bringing that same interest to other people. And I guess it's that same kind of conversation when you have, you know, priceless artworks from the Western canon in temperature controlled storage units, never to be seen by the public. It's quite devastating.
Right.
Yeah, I was just going to add on that I completely agree. I recently went and saw an exhibition which was in Brazil, but it was about like the contribution of Black artists to the art world over there, and including the exhibition was this like piece of jewelry that I think Black women used to wear, which was like this really intricate, almost like a charm that surrounds the stomach and had all of these little charms off of it, and really intricate, really beautiful. And I remember the curator said to me, oh yeah, this is owned by a private collector. And like, obviously knowing the history of Brazil, like that private collector is going to be white. And we're now, and she was talking about the like almost like ridiculousness of the situation of being now having to ask for permission from this collector to feature this work in the show, which was also this charm was made by a Black woman. But because I think it used ivory inside of it, which is like now really expensive, Black people can't afford to reclaim that item back. So it's just like this really weird space where it just made me really angry that we're now in a place where actually our own people don't get to see these items. And when they do, it depends on whether the private collector wants to loan them out or not. So yeah.
I think there's like ways of creating like situations where, because I know that some people are like, oh, but what would they go back to? But then like, okay, then how do you facilitate that? How do you, as someone who wants to see the longevity of these objects, to see them well maintained, how do you make sure that they like that, which is like supporting local institutions on the in these countries? Because I'm like, if you're a private collector, would you do that on a normal basis? You know, I feel like there's other ways of like engaging with that history of theft and ongoing colonization and ongoing, like, again, this is part of the reason why Africa is out of history, is because we don't get access to it like this. And so it's like, how do you remedy that, and whether or not this is like the best way to do it is by keeping the objects. I don't know why, but yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Right. Thank you very much, everybody. I think that might be a good ending point because we're 8 p.m. on the dot, unless anybody has any other burning questions. But lots of thank yous in the chat. So I really just want to echo that. Thank you so much. That was a really, really interesting conversation, and great to have 2 artists that we've worked with across 2 years be able to be in conversation with each other. And thank you so much, Hollie, for joining us as well. Really excited to see what comes out of the research you're doing with Towner. I just want to do a little plug for A-Space Artist Resources. At the moment, we have an Artist Resources survey out for 2023. So any artists that have been a part of our program, any artists that have used our program, the resources program in any way, please chip in, give your feedback on it so we can help make our offering better. And the reward is you get a free drink at God's House Tower Cafe of your choice. It could be soft, hot drink, or an alcoholic drink. So if that's not incentive, I don't know what is. But yeah, please do chip into that. And just to say thank you, everybody, once again for joining. And this is my last day at A-Space, so I won't be leading one of these again. But it was a really, really lovely high note to leave on as well. So thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you, Mary. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.